As I stated at the end of last video, things are not going to get better for Napoleon, and in fact, things are going to get a whole lot worse. In the months of his retreat through Russia into Europe, and he doesn't even actually reach Central Europe by the time the War of the Sixth Coalition breaks out. Specifically in March of 1813, the Sixth Coalition has formed and is made up of multiple nations that have already been fighting against him, such as Britain and Portugal, which are helping out Spain in the Peninsula War, trying to kick Napoleon out of the Iberian Peninsula. We've got Russia, who's already on the high tails and heels of Napoleon as he is retreating throughout their nation, or the western part of their nation, into, Prussia, which is where he ends up reaching as Prussia also turns on him now. Austria turns on him shortly thereafter, so does Sweden and even parts of Italy. And so this Sixth Coalition has formed, and this war is not only known as the War of the Sixth Coalition, but is also known as the War of European Liberation, because they truly are trying to liberate themselves, as well as just all of Europe, from Napoleon's reign. Now, Napoleon isn't without his own allies, most of them kind of forced. So obviously he still is in control of France, even though he is at this point really only in Central Europe, Germany, by the time the war breaks out, and has to send for help. He's got, of course, the Polish legionnaires for Warsaw, Poland, which he has kind of made a tiny little territory that he's supposed to be in control of at this point. It doesn't really last as Poland for all that long, though. We've got parts of Italy that join him. The Kingdom of Italy, which has this flag there, is kind of parts of northern Italy, but also the Kingdom of Naples. And if you recall, one of his brothers, Joseph, had previously been in control of it. Well, since then, things have changed. And in fact, this man right here, Joachim Murat, is actually now officially the king of Naples at this time in the 18-teens. And Joachim Murat is actually known in Naples as King Joachim Napoleon, because Joachim actually married Napoleon's younger sister, Caroline, and eventually was positioned, due to all of his, useful help and being an ally for Napoleon, given the place of Naples. Well, of course, that didn't stop Napoleon when he needed help from all of his best generals to invade Russia, to call up Joachim for help and to lead troops there. Now, Joachim was the one that was left behind in Russia with most of the troops to kind of try to get them out of Russia. He does succeed doing that, or at least for himself and a few troops, not many. But yes, that is this flag, the Kingdom of Naples. We, of course, have the Bavarian flag, the Confederation of the Rhine flag, and the Württemberg flag, all parts of Germany. And also Denmark-Norway jumps in on France's side, mostly because Sweden is kind of already at war, or trying to go to war with Denmark-Norway. They've always got that butting up against each other kind of thing with Sweden there, and then Denmark-Norway here. They're always kind of fighting each other. And so at this point, with Sweden jumping in on the coalition, Denmark-Norway kind of just joins in on the other side. And so you can kind of see where the Duchy of Warsaw is there, Confederation of the Rhine, parts of Italy here, and the French Empire, plus Denmark-Norway, like I said, are all together against really, basically most everything else. Obviously not the Ottoman Empire, they're staying out of it. But yeah, at this point, things are just getting worse for Napoleon. And also, halfway through the war, Denmark-Norway actually joins the coalition, as do parts of Germany. Definitely Bavaria does. I can't remember if the Confederation of the Rhine officially does, because they don't really have a ruler. They're just told by Napoleon whatever to do. But I think many of their little parts of their independent states were definitely trying to help the coalition, even though they were officially still locked into the Confederation itself. But moving on, Napoleon, however, does raise an army of 250,000 troops from France and and other, his allies throughout Europe. However, most of these troops and soldiers are just very young and inexperienced. Some of them are still in their younger teens or mid-teens, not quite adults. At this time, many of them have not fought at all and are so just basically young recruits. However, he still has his old guard pictured here. I mean, obviously this is an artistic rendition or a, kind of picture of people dressed up as the old guard. But the old guard are kind of his personal bodyguard and regiment that have kind of been with him for a long time. They were also known as the Immortals because they were kind of revered as these best troops that were so tough and strong that nothing really could kill them. And how did one get to become promoted into this old guard regiment? Well, they had to be under 35 years old and at least 5'10" in height, 5'10". They had to have, despite being under 35 years old, had to have had at least 10 years of experience fighting on the front lines of Napoleon's personal battles and campaigns. And so usually they had kind of this fierce loyalty to him because they had been on the winning side of countless battles with him for a decade before even being able to be promoted into or selected into the, old guard regiment. However, again, most of the troops in his army are all young and inexperienced, and so while he has a couple thousand old guard, that's not really going to be enough. However, before I move on from the old guard and the subject of height, this has kind of been an elephant in the room that I guess I should have addressed earlier on when I started covering Napoleon. There is such thing as how propaganda gets a collective think to an entire culture of people. And that is exactly what has happened with Napoleon. There is such thing as called the Napoleon complex, where it's supposed to be this idea of small men or small people get very angry as well as also take out on the world their frustrations about being short or small. Well, that is given as a kind of propaganda also in the years and decades after Napoleon was, overthrown and defeated. But why did that kind of beginning thought and Napoleon complex originate? Well, it originated because of the idea or myth that Napoleon was very, very short. And this was partially because of British propaganda. British propaganda harped on the fact that Napoleon was constantly this man that was surrounded by extremely tall and large military officers, such as the Old Guard and bodyguards. So he was actually 5'6", but when next to a bunch of people that were at least 5'10", then, yeah, he's gonna look short next to them. However, 5'6" was actually average in France and in Europe at this time. The average for men in the 1800s and late 1700s was actually anywhere between 5'4" and 5'7", so he's actually on the higher side of average. Now, why again did this kind of, myth get started? Well, Britain constantly kind of pushed this propaganda about him being short in political cartoons, as we have shown in this, in a couple of pictures here and there. It shows kind of Napoleon being shorter than others sometimes, or kind of fat and short and stocky, in a couple pictures I've shown, not many. There's also this idea that the British started running in newspaper ads that he was only 5'2", because that's what people's measurements said he was in France. However, the measurement of 5'2" in France was actually different than what is most regular measurements in the rest of the world, because France during the revolution created a new measurement system along with the same thing with their new calendar. What it actually equated to was 5'2" was actually 5'6" or 5'7" anywhere else. It was just a weird kind of way they translated things with something called the pounce as opposed to the inch. And so it's this kind of weird kind of thing that the British didn't even care about fact-checking because they wanted this propaganda to make everyone think Napoleon was this short, angry man that was just taking out his height issues on the rest of the world. Anyway, let's move on to the War of the Sixth Coalition again. Anyway, Napoleon's army of 250,000 people ends up actually having a few small losses for France early on as he's kind of getting this army together, because they aren't all armed up together all at once. Plus, also, a lot of it is young, inexperienced troops, so they're not going to be just the best during battle. Eventually, Napoleon pushes further and further into the Confederation of the Rhine and into near Prussia to try to take out Prussia in a battle. And what ends up resulting is the Battle of Leipzig, where he reaches the city of Leipzig in Saxony, in part of Germany. He has only at this point 175,000 men in his army, and the city of Leipzig has 2 rivers on the side of the city kind of meeting near the city, so he figures that even though his army isn't quite as big as the opposing force coming at him, and we'll talk about that in a moment, that he should be able to use the rivers and the city itself to defend the area easily, and also decides to split the city into 4 sections. However, it is not going to be all that easy. On October 16th through 19th, 1813, we have the Battle of Leipzig, which goes down in history as known also as the Battle of Nations. It is in fact the largest ever battle to have happened in the world anywhere, especially in Europe, but possibly anywhere around the world, before World War I took place. Okay, which will be later on in this course in the 1900s, 19-teens. The Allies and coalition forces of the Sixth Coalition have 430,000 troops, mostly from Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Sweden. However, some troops from some of the other allies of the coalition take place. However, not really many from Spain, Britain, or Portugal, because they're all concerned with the Peninsula War still going and winning there right now at this time, trying to finally force Napoleon out of Spain. And mind you, their forces are all committed down there, and the fighting is here, right, for Leipzig. Anyway, Napoleon ends up getting some reinforcements before the battle takes place, raising his army up to 200,000 from that earlier 175,000. So he feels a little bit better because he's only really outnumbered a bit over 2 to 1, and it's Napoleon, right? He thinks he can do this. And he, of course, has troops from France, Poland, parts of Italy, and some Germans of the Confederation of the Rhine under him. However, Napoleon's army is completely surrounded in this city. And after several days of fighting, okay, Napoleon is forced to retreat out of the city and west into France across one of the 2 rivers, basically going this way. Napoleon, as you can see, kind of the city of Leipzig with forests around it and the big blue rivers. And then troops of Napoleon are in blue, and then we've got all the red from all the other armies. Napoleon's and the fighting actually, as he retreats from one side of the army and this side through the city and this way, fighting actually goes on in the city itself as troops here kind of try to cut him off, himself, Napoleon himself, not just his army, because they're trying to capture him. Because they figure if they can capture him, they can kind of end the war right then and there, that his generals will kind of cease and desist as well as the rest of France. Napoleon does get away. However, his losses are 38,000 killed and wounded from his army, and another 35,000 captured. Plus, an additional 15 to 20,000 end up dying or getting heavily injured or also captured when they try crossing one of the rivers a little bit further away from the city as well, which is just a disaster when some of the young recruits try to just kind of ford the river and it's just way too deep. And then they've got their big, thick uniforms, which are soaking up all the water, plus their backpacks, their gun, all of that. It just turns into a disaster for a lot of them, sadly. Anyway, the coalition allies of the Sixth Coalition lost more than 54,000 killed and wounded, but recall, even though that is more killed and wounded than Napoleon lost, he had half as many troops to begin with, and, you know, he's on the retreat. So it is a victory at the Battle of Nations for the Sixth Coalition. Well, after the war is over, a giant monument to the Battle of Leipzig, or also known as the Battle of Nations Monument, is built. It is a whopping 299 feet tall, and you can see it here, and it's massive. This is a door arch there, and it is absolutely huge. In fact, if I go around to this side of it, the far side, which you couldn't see from the other picture, you actually can see cars compared to it. It is an absolutely incredibly large monument built to all of the troops that fought on both sides, but, you know, kind of with the pushing of, you know, this war and this battle was fought to stop Napoleon basically being this absolute leader over all of Europe. Okay, at this time. After the Battle of Leipzig, Napoleon is forced to retreat all the way to Paris. And he makes a speech to the French Senate. And he states, "A year ago, all Europe marched with us. Today, all Europe marches against us." Basically saying that, you know, right before the Russian campaign, all of Europe, not including really Britain or Portugal, right, were on his side and were helping him invade Russia. And now, a year later, everyone is against France and him. And so, the coalition's armies at this point begin pushing into France toward Paris from, you know, Germany. However, the British army under Arthur Wellesley down here in the Peninsula War have even actually begun to move up from Spain into France and actually cross the Pyrenees Mountains into France and start also quickly making their way to Paris as well. And so at this point, things really look like it's the end for Napoleon. Well, the Treaty of Chaumont is signed in March of 1814 between the members of the coalition only. So only the Sixth Coalition members take part in this treaty. France is not taking part in it at all. However, most of France's allies from this coalition war, most of them have now joined the coalition. Definitely Denmark, Norway, parts of Germany. I don't think the two parts of Italy or Warsaw, Poland did, but definitely Denmark, Norway, and parts of Germany had by at this point. Now, this treaty, the Treaty of Chaumont, what it does and what it states is that the members of the Sixth Coalition in this treaty agree to protect each other against any possible attack by France in the next 20 years. So basically all the way up to 1834. Okay? Up to 1834, if France tries to attack any member of the coalition, all the other members of the coalition will jump to help that nation that is attacked by France. And that they would each supply 150,000 troops to whatever war or whatever forces, coalition, or future endeavor against France in those 20 years would be needed. Okay? That each nation would supply 150,000 troops. So that's a lot of troops if you add them all up, if it was absolutely needed. They also decide amongst themselves that France must give up all of its conquered territories, all of them, or the war will continue until France agrees to give up those conquered territories. The coalition proposes it to Napoleon, and he refuses to agree. He's just like, no, I'm not signing this. I'm not doing that. However, by early April 1814, Napoleon has really realized things are over. That the coalition forces are now fully right outside basically Paris at this point, within a few miles in some cases, a little bit more in some others. His troops are not going to be able to defeat both armies, the ones coming from Germany or the ones coming from Spain at this point, and that he has to basically agree to certain, agreements. Even if he's not going to agree to everything, he needs to come up with some way to, end things on a somewhat not horrible note for him. Napoleon decides to abdicate, meaning give up the throne of emperor. He hopes that his son, Napoleon II, his infant, still baby son, will become emperor. And that is the plan. That Napoleon II would become Emperor Napoleon II, and that Napoleon's wife, the Austrian princess Marie-Louise, will become regent for the young Napoleon II. But the French Senate and the coalition decide to give the crown to King Louis XVIII. Okay, if you recall, King Louis XVI was the one that had been executed by guillotine, okay, at the beginning of the French Revolution, or into the French Revolution, right? And then, as the French Revolution went on, his young son, who was about 10 years old, became technically king, okay, and was King Louis XVII, but, was in jail, so not really ruling France. And then when that young son died, Louis XVI's brother, aka Louis XVII's uncle, it became the new king, Louis XVIII. Again, he was in exile, he wasn't in France, he never really ruled, but at this point, the French Senate and the Sixth Coalition decide, no, he gets to be the ruler of France, not Napoleon II. You, Napoleon I, aka the Napoleon that we've been talking about the whole time, that Napoleon does not get to make the decision, okay, is what is decided by the Senate and the coalition. That means, with the crowning again officially of Louis XVIII as King of France, monarchy of France is restored. Now, yeah, technically it was kind of a monarchy under the emperorship, right? One could argue. But officially now, the Bourbon dynasty royal family is restored, and the monarchy in France is also restored. This will lead to the Treaty of Fontainebleau, which is signed on April 11th, 1814, where the coalition leaders realize they don't trust Napoleon, that he just tried to kind of come up with a way to make his son in charge with his wife as regent. Well, what's to say that he wouldn't also try to basically be regent unofficially, right? And what if he was to try to stir up armies again? And so they really decide at this point that they cannot trust him at all, and decide that they are going to force Napoleon under several more terms. The first of these terms is that Napoleon must renounce the thrones of France and Italy, because remember, he had put his young infant son as basically leader or king of Italy or ruler of one of the Italies, okay? So Napoleon has to give up France and Italy for himself, as well as all future heirs. So his young son does not get to be Emperor of France or continue being the ruler of Italy either. Napoleon is then also forced to be sent now to the small island of Elba, okay, a tiny little island between Corsica and Italy. It is a total of 86 square miles in size, the island of Elba. It is it is 30 miles off the coast of Corsica, And Corsica is the island where Napoleon was born on and raised on, okay, until he went to school in France. And so it's almost basically within eyesight. On a good day, he can see his old homeland of Corsica. It's a small little island, like I said, only 86 square miles. He is able to, however, Napoleon is allowed to set up a principality ruling that small nation, or that small island, where he gets to rule it completely. Okay, he takes over as the new government of that island. He is also allowed to take him 1,000 soldiers. Now, of the 1,000 troops that go with him, 400 of them are members of the old guard that had survived from even the Battle of Leipzig when things got really bad. Okay, and so several members of the old guard were killed on the retreat from Leipzig, but those 400 remaining, are allowed to be of the 1,000 that he gets to command in that tiny little island of Elba. Here's actually a picture of the island of Elba, what it looks like, as well as a political cartoon encompassing that picture of the rise and fall of Napoleon from a young boy on Corsica to a young soldier in France to eventually a military officer in France to basically a general, thanks to the Battle of Toulon in 1793, all the way now to kind of consul, to even now emperor, to where he is continuously conquering Europe, and now in a little sled on his retreat from Russia, trying to not freeze to death in his sled, filled with hay and blankets, to now basically being kicked off of the cliff of Europe into exile in Elba by, of course, kicked off by troops of basically everybody else in Europe, right? And so now he is only in this tiny little island of Elba, kind of commanding a piddly sum of some troops there. A mere 1,000 troops for when he used to command over 500,000, moving into, or even 3/4 when he moved into Russia, right? So this was drawn during the period, and it shows him basically his career and his life, where even if we just take from here, when he started in our class's lectures, okay, in 1793 to the time where he is exiled to Elba, he had basically been an important part of European history for 2 decades, okay, 21 or 22 years, give or take, at that point. And so begins the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is a peace treaty and huge social affair that begins in September of 1814, kind of celebrating the idea of Napoleon being exiled to Elba, that no one will have to worry about him again, and that all of the leaders in Europe can get together, have a big party, and figure out new borders and new treaties determining what things are going to be like in Europe moving forward in this post-Napoleonic period. It will be held in the city of Vienna, and it will officially last until June of 1815, but as you'll see, it will actually last a little bit longer for certain members. There will be 200 delegates from all across Europe, not just continental Europe, but also Britain, Norway, Sweden, Russia, all over, the islands throughout, etc. All of them will take place or take part in this, and it's all fun and games at the peace signing and the conference until all of a sudden some of the most alarming news that any of them could ever hear happens, and we'll talk about what that news is next lecture.